Sharp. This is your APTN News Brief for Wednesday, April 17th. The Trudeau government has unveiled its 2024 budget, and while there are line items funding Indigenous priorities, as we'll hear from Fraser Needham, it's less spending overall than in previous years.
Mr. Speaker, we are acting today to ensure fairness for every generation.
This is what Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland had to say about the 2024 budget in the House of Commons on Tuesday.
We are moving with purpose to help build more homes faster. We are making life cost less. We're driving the kind of economic growth that will ensure every generation of Canadians can reach their full potential.
But unlike previous speeches by finance ministers, the word Indigenous was not included. And it is a budget that invests less in Indigenous priorities than in previous years. From 2015 to the current fiscal year, the Liberals spent about $32 billion on Indigenous initiatives. That is now projected to drop to about $9 billion in new spending over the next 5 years. This year's budget targets $918 million over 5 years for Indigenous housing and infrastructure. This is also much lower than the roughly $6 billion over the same time period put forward in the previous two budgets. And only a drop in the bucket of the $349 billion the Assembly of First Nations says is needed to address the First Nations infrastructure gap by 2030. There's not much for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls initiatives either. Just $1.3 million over 3 years to co-develop a red dress alert system. Other Indigenous spending in the budget includes $1.5 billion over 5 years for the Indigenous communities exercising jurisdiction over child welfare services, $1.1 billion for First Nations and Inuit health, $927 million for on-reserve income assistance. The government is also making about $5 billion in loan guarantees available for Indigenous communities that want to pursue natural resource projects. There's also $388 million over 5 years in new supports for Indigenous entrepreneurship and tourism. Other new spending includes $290 million over 5 years to support Indigenous cultures and language, $243 million for First Nations post-secondary education, and $168 million to address anti-Indigenous racism in healthcare. The deficit is expected to drop slightly to $38.4 billion this fiscal year from $40 billion last year. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
So those are the numbers. Critics who crunched them were quick to poke holes. And although Chrystia Freeland's budget set aside billions for Indigenous issues, opposition leaders from the NDP and Greens saw its shortcomings.
What is the plan to ensure that Indigenous communities that for so long have not received adequate funding for infrastructure and housing, what's the plan to close that gap?
Okay, the red dress alert. We've debated it. We want to see it. 1.3 million over 3 years. Contrast that with the immediate 47 million for the crisis in auto thefts.
To New York City, where the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues continues. Discussions so far have included the implementation of Indigenous rights and the problematic operations of Canadian-owned mining companies in the Amazon. Here with her wrap-up of Day 2 events, Angel Moore.
I'm here at the United Nations headquarters in New York City, where representatives voice their concerns over Canadian mining companies operating in South America, saying they are destroying their lands. Zenaida Yasukama's community is in the Amazon of Peru. Gisela Hurtado translated.
We would like that the Canadian government listen to us and stop destroying our Indigenous territories, that they can take all the measures, stop talking with the Ecuadorian government, because our territories are not on sale. Our territories are alive. Is there where we harvest, is there where we have everything for our food. We ask respect for our rights and also for the rights of nature.
Hunter Corbett is a youth representative with the Ontario Native Women's Association, or ONWA. She says everyone wants to protect the earth.
Doesn't matter where you're from, we all have one similarity in what we're here to speak about, and that's the protection of our people, our language, our culture, and Mother Earth as well, because we're all connected in that way. If Mother Earth is not safe, neither are we as women and as people around the world.
Cora McGuire-Syret is the executive director of ONWA. She says the forum is an opportunity for women to reclaim their voices.
We're here mentoring and supporting youth and them speaking on their own behalf with their own voices and speaking to their own solutions, because the interventions we make this week is going to impact them and their future, because this is like their world and their leadership.
Angel Moore, APTN National News, New York City.
The ceremonial signing of an Aboriginal title document this past weekend on Haida Gwaii has both the province of British Columbia and the Haida Nation in a celebratory mood. Lee Wilson now on a deal both sides have hailed as historic.
Representatives from the province of British Columbia and the Council of Haida Nation gathered for a historic signing ceremony. Negotiations for the Haida Title Lands Agreement started more than 20 years ago. Gagwis Jason Alsop thanked everyone for coming to witness the historic day on Haida Gwaii.
It's a continuation of many years of work in our recent times since the coming of the Crown, but it's the carrying forward of our inherent Haida title that we've been passed down to us from our ancestors and the responsibility that comes with it.
The agreement will shift Crown land on the islands of Haida Gwaii back to the Haida. According to the provincial government, the transfer will be carried out in stages, but private property will not be affected, and the province will still be responsible for infrastructure and services. BC Premier David Eby says this agreement was long overdue.
What we've done here together is something that the courts have been telling governments in Canada to do for many generations now. That the provincial and federal government need to sit down with First Nations governments and recognize title.
The Haida Nation gifted Premier Eby with a blanket made by Musqueam weaver Deborah Sparrow. BC Indigenous Relations Minister Murray Rankin stressed the importance of resolving matters through negotiations.
We could have been facing each other in a courtroom. We could have been fighting for years and years, but we chose a different path. We chose a path that requires creativity and courage. And we got there together because we are trying to create a better future for our children.
The Haida and the province sat down and officially signed their agreement. Gagwis said the signing puts to rest any debate or conflict around the lands, and they can now move forward together.
So it's an important time, and it lays the foundation for a future together where we can acknowledge the truth, acknowledge the history, but also look forward to build a brighter future for the Haida Nation and the people of Haida Gwaii and provide hope and inspiration.
BC will introduce legislation later this month to formally recognize Haida title in provincial law. Lee Wilson, APTN National News, Kitimat.
And finally, the Supreme Court of Canada has just ruled in favor of the Blood Tribe in a land dispute that dates back more than a century. Back in 1877, Ottawa had agreed to allocate a square mile of land to each Blood family of 5, an agreement the Crown, by its own acknowledgement, failed to live up to, according to the court. It therefore ruled the First Nation is entitled to more than 400 square kilometers of additional territory in southern Alberta. The Blood Tribe Council says it's now considering its options. And that's your APTN News Brief for Wednesday, April 17th. I'm Rick Harp.